The committee will come back to order. Before I recognize Ms. Brown, I want to make this statement that during the recess for votes, my staff made contact with a new whistleblower who provided a credible account that a FEMA contractor visited the home of an elderly disabled veteran's family around October 10th following Hurricane Helene. While there, the FEMA contractor recommended that the family remove Trump campaign materials and signs from both their house and their yard. He warned the family that his FEMA supervisors do not take kindly to Trump supporters and that they seem as domestic terrorists. The elderly homeowners were so frightened by this and afraid that they would not recover their loss that they removed all Trump materials and signs. Nevertheless, FEMA has not returned to their residence. This took place not in Florida, but in Georgia. Administrator, we're happy to provide you with more information on this, but we and the American people want to know what FEMA is doing to ensure that political discrimination is not dictating how the American people are receiving aid following a disaster.
Mr. Chairman, will you share the information with the minority as well so we can follow up on that?
Absolutely. All right, now, Chair recognizes Ms. Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This hearing has shown us why it is so important for our federal officials to remain unbiased, nonpartisan, and committed to helping every single American under their mandate. The work of the Federal Emergency Management Agency is critical and will become even more important as we continue to experience more severe weather events because of climate change. Just this year in Northeast Ohio, we experienced severe drought, extreme heat, flash floods, and destructive tornadoes, all of which took place in the span of just 1 month. I am very thankful that no deaths occurred as a result, but the destruction from these storms and climate events continue to be felt in my district and every district across the country. We are grateful for the assistance that FEMA provided, helping to assess the damage and get Northeast Ohio back on its feet. As my colleagues have said, storms and other disaster events have no political party, and they do not discriminate. They don't care if you live in a blue state, a red state, or a purple state. That is why FEMA and all of our federal agencies must remain fiercely nonpartisan. So, Administrator Criswell, can you speak to how FEMA accomplishes its mission and goals in a nonpartisan way, and why doing so is so important?
Congresswoman, the work that we do, again, our mission statement of helping people before, during, and after disasters is so critical, and especially, as you mentioned, in a time when we are seeing an increase in the number of severe weather events across the United States. These weather events are becoming more complex, creating additional challenges for people across the country to recover from these events. We have to support everybody that's been impacted by this, and it is one of the reasons why I have been so determined throughout my time here to remove as many barriers to accessing our programs as possible, like the recent changes to our individual assistance program, which has been transformational. The biggest changes that we've done in probably 20 years to open up more assistance for people across the United States that have been impacted. We have to help these people get back on their road to recovery, and that's what FEMA does. We jumpstart that recovery.
And can you tell us why public confidence in your mission is critical to the safety and well-being of the American public?
There is nothing more important than trust. We have to have the trust of the American people. We have to have trust of the communities, the leaders that we are there to serve. We work for the governor. We work for those local communities. These disasters start and end with them, and we are there to support them, and we have to have that trust. That is why we embed people side by side with the governor's team, with community leaders' teams, so we know what issues are going on, what the challenges their communities are facing, so we can move resources into those communities to help meet those needs.
Thank you. Now, it's unfortunate we've seen extremist conspiracy theories regarding FEMA's disaster response. Can you please speak to how this harmful and inaccurate rhetoric undermines your agency's mission to provide support to Americans impacted by disaster regardless of party affiliation or anything else?
Yeah, the amount of misinformation, Congresswoman, that we have seen throughout this event has really been at a whole new level. But this is something that FEMA has experienced since it was instituted in 1979. And we need to be able to reach people where they're at to help them on their road to recovery. And we do this in a number of ways. We can translate information into their native language. We can reach out to local faith-based organizations, trusted leaders in the community to help them reach out to people that have been impacted so they know that the information they're getting is accurate and that they can and should apply for assistance with FEMA.
Thank you for that. And this is how our essential federal agencies should continue to operate, unaffected by partisan politics and above political interference. I'm very glad that this is something we are in agreement on today and look forward to it continuing into the future. And with that, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Chair recognizes Mr. Sessions from Texas.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Administrator, thank you for taking time to be here. I felt like that in listening to you earlier that your questions, the answers, and the things that you responded with not only showed that you have the capacity to understand the task in front of you, but that you've effectively dealt with it. If I could just provide two pieces of information, I'm not even looking for a response, but two pieces of information. We did a subcommittee hearing out in Hawaii, and we had an opportunity, the subcommittee which I chair, federal workforce and government operations in federal workforce. And it was very important for us to go, and we learned that it was the most expensive disaster in the country's history, some $3 billion. I was surprised to hear that it was the most expensive, but that's the testimony. I would draw to your attention that much of the delay that has caused much of the money that has been spent, I think could be negotiated better with the governor of the state. The FEMA representatives who were there did a great job, and I enjoy them. But they felt like that the delays in their ability to make progress, to get people back onto their own home site, back in their own homes, has been delayed because the governor will not issue the necessary paperwork for them to move forward. And so they have moved them off a little bit, maybe a mile to the west, and they're building a huge new subdivision of mobile homes, essentially, that are going to cost $1 million each. And I think that many of those could have been placed maybe 5 or 6, 4 or 5 months earlier with the assistance of the governor. I would encourage you to please engage the governor. Secondly, in 2010, there was a blast that happened at West Texas, a great big explosion, and part of that explosion destroyed many of the schools. I think the elementary school, the junior high, and the high school. We are still now 14 years off that, and there is a disagreement about the aggregated money that was spent, and FEMA still believes that West Texas, West Independent School District, still owes back a great deal of money. And my staff got it deeply engaged. About a 5-hour Zoom call occurred, and at that, I think that there could have been more transparency on behalf of the federal government, because there were dollars that were lumped into aggregate areas that we could not tell what was in there, and I don't think it was a perfect match. It was apples on one side and oranges on another, and the city of West, including the school district, put things that they paid for instance, some athletic fields and some other things which were not broken out and which may have been an assumption that somebody else was paying for things. My point of saying this, you haven't personally looked at this, and I have not either, but I'm going to. And I'd like to, when I contact your regional coordinator there, I'd like to advise him that I told you that I think more transparency will be necessary so that we can effectively put this to bed. And I would like to ask that you somehow give some signal or notice let's get transparency. Let's resolve this. 14 years is too long. We do appreciate FEMA. We do appreciate the work they've done, and I'm proud of your work as the administrator. Mr. Chairman, I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes Ms. Lee from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I would also like to thank Administrator Criswell for being here with us today on a very long day, obviously. But let's be real, you know, what FEMA does has never been more critical, because right now, climate change has completely flipped the script. Storms like Milton and Helene hitting landlocked states, that was unthinkable not too long ago. But now we've got places like Asheville, North Carolina, 2,000 feet above sea level and hundreds of miles from the coast, getting wrecked by hurricanes and extreme weather. So, Administrator Criswell, as we're seeing more frequent and intense storms, what new challenges are you seeing emerge for your agency?
As you mentioned, Congresswoman, we are seeing events like we have not seen before. I mean, I can think back to a year ago with the wildfires in Maui that were happening at the same time that we had a hurricane in the Pacific heading towards the desert lands of California. The types of events and severe weather events that we are seeing at a scale that we have not seen previously. I mean, as an example, 117-ish disasters last year, and we have over 170 already declared this year. The challenges we face is making sure as we are rebuilding these communities that we do so in a way that makes them stronger against future storms, and not just the risks that they've faced in the past, but the risks that they will face in the future.
Certainly. So as climate change worsens, then would you say that your agency is going to need more resources or fewer resources?
I think we will definitely need more resources to be able to keep up with the pacing demand of the events that we've been responding to.
Certainly. It doesn't take a genius to figure that one out. More disasters in more areas mean more help will be needed. The climate crisis is here. Pretending that it doesn't exist or that it won't get worse only harms the people that we have been sent to this body to represent. For the sake of not only my constituents, but people all over the country who may face natural disasters they've never even thought to prepare for, I hope that we can all come together to give the American people the help that they deserve. That means making sure that FEMA is fully funded and that they are serving all survivors of natural disasters. So let's be honest about what's happening here today. My Republican colleagues want to cherry pick this incident and sensationalize it. Well, the reality is that for decades, there has been different treatment by FEMA, for instance, towards Black and brown communities. Hurricanes Katrina, Maria, Ida, Florence, Harvey, we all saw communities of color served last or not at all. And those are difficult to discuss, but important. Several reports and investigations confirmed what those of us who are part of those communities already knew, that white disaster victims were helped first and with more money than Black people of color, even when the damage was the same. Rather than fixate on a single incident, this committee should be working to ensure that the entire system is equitable for all Americans and that we're building on the work of the administration to make that so. With that said, while we're reflecting and analyzing our disaster response, I'd like to ask you, Administrator Criswell, what has FEMA done to ensure that all communities, particularly the most marginalized, are being fully served? How has there been improvements since previous storms where we have seen critiques or even difficulties in administering service?
You know, I have served as a local emergency manager, and I understand what it is like to be a customer of FEMA. I have seen people within my own communities that have had a hard time accessing the programs. One of the first things that I did was change some of our policies to ensure that we understand everybody's unique needs. For example, we know that many homeowners in all parts of the country don't have traditional mortgages or traditional deeds to their homes, and so we expanded the types of documentation that we accept from people so they can access our programs. These are the kind of barriers that were affecting people everywhere, and we wanted to make sure that everyone that was impacted by a disaster could access our programs with minimal amount of barriers. Those are the changes that we've made. We continue to make more. There's more work to do.
Certainly, but those are such critical steps that we've seen results from. So we thank you for that. I don't think it can be stressed enough how important FEMA is going to be in the years to come. The climate crisis means recognizing that we're about to see weather events we've just never expected. Hurricanes ravaging inland communities, uncontrollable wildfires, as you've mentioned, across more areas of the country, uncontrollable tornadoes, floods, severe storms that are upending lives. Every dollar not invested in FEMA now is just going to burn us in the years to come. When communities are level, it costs more money to fix. We have no choice but to invest if we don't want to see communities completely erased after climate catastrophes. I agree with my colleagues across the aisle that partisanship has no place in distributing government services and aid, neither does race or socioeconomic status. That being said, as more and more of our constituents are affected by increasing natural disasters, it's more important than ever that we maintain that same commitment to nonpartisan distribution of aid in the coming years. I thank you again for joining us and for your testimony today, and I yield back.
Chair now recognizes Mr. Burchett from Tennessee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Criswell, there seems to be a huge discrepancy in federal cost share between different states. And if I had a map, I could show, well, there it is up there on there. Why is East Tennessee only granted 45 days of 100% federal cost share? Well, it seems like parts of North Carolina, as you can see, were granted 180 days of the 100% federal cost share.
The cost share requests for each of the states were granted based on the governor's request.
The governor. So when I go to Governor Bill Lee, he's going to tell me that was what he requested.
That was the governor's initial request. He has since then requested an additional amount of time, and that's currently under review.
Okay. We'd be very appreciative if you could help with that. Why is there a political border between Tennessee and North Carolina determining the federal cost share? Does that fall back on the governors, or is that something that you all do? I mean, it just seems like if you got a loss, you know, why should it stop at the border if obviously the devastation was in North Carolina and then the water came down through there and just wiped out parts of Tennessee as well?
Presidential disaster declarations are based by statute on individual states, and then everything that goes with that, to include cost share, is based on the request from the governor as well as the overall capacity and needs of that state.
Okay. When would the governor's review be finalized?
We plan to have that review done in the next several weeks.
Okay. If it's done in the next several weeks, won't that delay the cleanup by these companies?
No, it should not delay it. This is only about a cost share. So the work to continue to remove debris or to stabilize critical infrastructure should and needs to continue, and then we will continue to reimburse states on the work that they have done.
Okay. Is North Carolina eligible for 180 days of federal cost share due to the severity of the disaster, or is it just that goes back just to the governor what they were asking?
In North Carolina's case, the governor did ask for 180 days, and based on the severity and magnitude of the disaster and the scale of the impacts across western North Carolina, it was determined that that was an appropriate request.
Okay. What documentation do you require to reimburse disaster victims for temporary shelter?
For individuals themselves or for states that covered sheltering costs?
Individuals.
So if an individual has experienced costs related to evacuating their area either pre-landfall or during a disaster, they are eligible for a number of different programs. They can get rental assistance, and that can be determined just by applying for FEMA additional assistance. But if they need continuing rental assistance, they will have to show receipts that they are continuing to pay for rent. Every case is going to be specific and unique to each individual, and we work with them on a case-by-case basis.
The lady who's been alluded to many times, I believe her name, the FEMA employee, name was Marnie Washington, if I'm correct, who gave the order to discriminate against Trump supporters. Who was her supervisor? And was the supervisor disciplined, or was it just totally taken as a individual action?
At this point, the unacceptable behavior of this FEMA crew lead, this individual person, has led to my direction to have her terminated. We are conducting ongoing investigations, and we will continue to provide any necessary disciplinary action as necessary. We have also engaged the Inspector General to assist us and provide their own independent investigation.
Was this person's supervisor investigated as well?
This is an ongoing investigation, and everybody that has been involved in that incident will be part of that investigation.
When do you expect that to be finalized? Is there any way to tell?
I think it's too early to tell an exact time frame, especially since we want to bring in the Inspector General to conduct their own investigation.
Okay. What documents do illegal migrants need for shelter?
I'm not an immigration agency. I would have to defer you to DHS.
So they don't come to you all and say, when they apply for FEMA, they don't do that?
Only legal citizens can get additional assistance from FEMA. There are a number of ways that they can do that, and it's all described in statute.
Okay. Secretary Mayorkas uses authority under Title V of the 2024 Appropriations Bill to shift funds from the migrant program to disaster relief programs. How do you plan to restore the faith in FEMA after that occurred?
Can you repeat that question, sir?
Well, I'm going to run out of time, if that's all right, Mr. Chairman. Has Secretary Mayorkas used his authority under Title V of the 2024 Appropriations Bill to shift funds from migrant programs to disaster relief programs?
I'm not aware of any funding being shifted from migrant programs into disaster relief programs.
Or
disaster relief is a separate appropriation from Congress.
Okay, for disaster relief to migrant, either way?
There has been no money shifted from the disaster relief fund under this administration to support migrant programs.
Okay, I've run out of time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chair recognizes Ms. Crockett.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you so much, Administrator, for being here. A couple of things that I want to try to run through as quickly as possible. Are you familiar with NOAA?
NOAA, the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration?
Yes.
Yes.
And out of curiosity, you obviously knew what NOAA stood for. When we are trying to prepare for these disasters as they are impending, do you rely on information that you receive from them in getting prepared for a potential disaster?
NOAA is a critical partner of FEMA's, whether it's through their National Hurricane Center to give us forecasts for where hurricanes and the strength of hurricanes are going to hit, or the National Water Center that helps us understand what the flooding impacts are going to be, or the Severe Weather Center that talks about tornado forecasts. All of this is important to make sure that, one, we can inform individuals that are in harm's way, but also help us prepare and pre-position our resources to support any immediate response needs.
Thank you for that. So you'd agree with me that any administration that would decide that it wants to get rid of NOAA, that would probably make your job that much more difficult?
Without the scientific data that we get from NOAA to help us make decisions and warn the public, it would make that job more difficult.
Okay, I want to talk about money, and I want to talk about it a lot here in a minute. Listen, we had a vote that was right before these terrible hurricanes that we've been talking about, Milton and Helene, came in. And in that particular vote, we had an opportunity to decide how much funding was going to go to FEMA. And it is my understanding that on this committee, we had a few members that decided that they were not going to vote in support of that funding. I don't know how closely you follow, but we had a number of members who actually served not only on this committee, but they serve in states that have been mentioned, such as Tennessee, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. And right now, it is my understanding that we're having a hearing because there is a concern about a specific individual who potentially skipped, I think the total was 20 homes, correct? And in those 20 homes, if you had to guess, and I don't know if you've been back to those 20 homes at this point in time to see what resources, if any, were needed, but if you had to guess approximately how much money are we talking about did not potentially get distributed immediately to those 20 homes?
All 20 homes have been revisited by our disaster survivor assistance teams. I do not know how many have actually applied for assistance, but the maximum amount that's available for an individual through this disaster was $42,500 for housing assistance and another possible $42,500 for other needs assistance.
Okay. What I'm hearing, though, is we're talking about 20 houses. The data that I have in front of me shows that over 18,000 interactions have been conducted for survivors of both Hurricane Helene and Milton. Is that approximately correct?
I would say that that number is probably much higher than that.
Okay. Give me your number. Well, somewhere, let's presuppose that the number was 18,000. If we talked about 20 out of 18,000, that would mean that we are currently using resources to have a hearing about 0.1% of interactions. So this is not something that we would consider to be widespread when we start talking about percentages that are as low as 0.1%. In addition to that, it's my understanding that as of November 13th, FEMA has delivered over 16 million meals, over 18 million liters of water, over 3,000 rolls of blue roof sheeting, over 700,000 gallons of fuel, and additionally, FEMA has delivered over 2,000 tractor-trailer deliveries containing critical supplies. Do you have any reason to have any discrepancies about those numbers?
No.
In addition to that, it's my understanding, oh, I'm sorry, you're right, that over 671,000 households impacted by Hurricane Helene have received over $503 million from FEMA's Serious Needs Program, and over 218,000 households impacted by Hurricane Milton have received over $145 million. Yet and still, we had members on this committee, it looks like we had, there were 82 members that opposed the bill to fund when we knew that this was coming, thanks to NOAA, and 19 of the 26 Republicans on this oversight committee voted against the bill to keep FEMA funded, and 9 are in states that were directly hit. I don't understand why we come in and pretend that we have all these issues with your agency, and I thank you for your service, when you don't want to fund it. You can't complain about these issues, and when we're talking about, you know, the people that got skipped over, maybe or maybe not, ultimately, there was a concern about safety. Now, hopefully we will get the full investigation, but we know that it was Trump that was out there himself. He was putting out disinformation and misinformation to the extent that y'all had to set up an entire website to try to combat it. That was in disservice to all Americans, because when a hurricane hits, it doesn't go into the Democratic areas. It doesn't go to the independents. It doesn't go to the Republicans. It goes to American citizens. It is time for us to decide that we are going to work together and make sure that we can take care of people regardless of the decisions that they decide to make on who they want to put into the White House. And I thank you for your service, and I yield.
Chair now recognizes Mr. Fallon from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, listen, when a natural disaster hits, it's devastating for those who are affected. Their lives, their health, their well-being, their livelihoods, they're all at risk. And it tosses their lives upside down. And in short, in the aftermath of these acts of God, we're going to find Americans at their most vulnerable. And they're desperate and they need help. And FEMA is the one federal agency whose primary mission is to provide them that help. And the American taxpayers, as we all know, fund it. And it doesn't matter if you're a Democrat, it doesn't matter if you're a Republican, you're an American and you pay taxes to ensure that you can be helped if, God forbid, that act of God occurs. And we don't help them by arbitrarily deciding if they support one particular candidate over another. That's not only immoral and wrong, it's criminal. It shatters the Hatch Act. And then we have a FEMA employee, unfortunately, I believe it's Marnie Washington, who was purposely and deliberately withholding aid to Trump supporters. She's going to avoid those homes that had Trump signs. Director, fair to say that you were horrified when you learned of that?
It is completely unacceptable, and it was heartbreaking to hear that anybody that was impacted by this disaster potentially did not get the assistance they needed.
So would you say that it was an isolated incident?
At this time, I have seen no other evidence that goes beyond Ms. Washington, but this is under continuing investigation.
So it wasn't systemic. You don't feel it was systemic?
I understand the reports that this employee is making. However, the evidence that has been presented to me does not show that this is a widespread problem, but I want to be certain that this is not a widespread
Ms. Washington
problem.
disagreed, of course, and she said that she'd been scapegoated and that the FEMA, the agency, prioritizes avoidance and de-escalation in situations where some employees may feel unsafe, like, according to her, urban areas where there might be unleashed dogs. And, I mean, the thing that gets me about that is, Director, you don't think that a Trump sign poses a danger akin to a runaway dog, right?
Of course not.
I mean, that's ridiculous. And Trump supporters certainly shouldn't be compared to or treated like unleashed dogs, nor should anybody, even somebody that supported Ms. Harris for president. And so to determine whether or not this is systemic and this is imbued into the fabric of the agency or not, would you agree that an independent investigation should be called for?
Absolutely.
And I think it was Representative Perry, and you had a discussion about that today. Was that right? I don't know if it was today, but
It was this morning.
This
and
morning,
yes,
yeah.
And I have already reached out to the IG. We had been working with them, but I have directly asked them to perform an independent
oh,
investigation.
I think that's great. The thing is, like on a timeline basis, you had October 9th, Milton reaches landfall, and then the 24th, there was a whistleblower complaint. 28th, your legal staff found out about it, and we know for sure on the 7th that the higher-ups, did you find out about this earlier, or was it on the 7th?
I was in North Carolina on November 7th when it was brought to my attention that we had this potential issue. I asked my team to look into it and get me additional information. They presented me the written text of this employee, and then I directed the termination.
Okay, so did they present you the written text on the 7th?
On the 9th.
On the 9th, and that's when you fired her on the 9th?
Correct.
Okay,
After I saw written evidence.
There was a Daily Wire article that happened to just hit on the 8th, and that was like national news. And then she was fired the very next day. I was just concerned about the fact that your legal staff knew on the 28th, and this woman was not only continually being employed by FEMA, but also as a supervisor as well. And then, so you do agree that we should have an IG investigation, and I think that I also do, but that wasn't until today. Why the delay?
There was no delay. We have been working with the IG since this was brought to the Office of Professional Responsibility. They have been determining whether or not they were going to take this case, and I just directly asked them today.
So you didn't directly ask them. You could have directly asked them earlier, though, fair to say?
Fair to say.
Okay,
But we had
but there
been
was a
working with
delay
them,
of
and
a couple of
we brought them
weeks.
into this.
Okay. So, you know,
Very beginning.
it's interesting being on this committee, Mr. Chairman, for 4 years. It seems no matter what we talk about, all roads lead back to Donald Trump. And for our friends across the aisle, he's the boogeyman Trump. We can be talking about 40-year high inflation, it's somehow Trump's fault. 20-year high interest rates, Trump. We're talking about a FEMA employee denying services to supporters of Donald Trump, and that's somehow all they want to talk about is Donald Trump. Edited, cherry-picked, out-of-context information. I think that's called misinformation, if I'm not mistaken. And it's unfortunate because here's the facts, that President Donald Trump was president for 4 years, and he approved 89 disasters in states that opposed him, including 17 in California, more than any state. More than 80% of the disaster requests that President Trump denied came from governors of states he won in 2016. And I'm going to have a quote here from an expert. There's really no difference that I've seen, said Chad Bergenis, the executive director of the Association of State Floodplain Managers. That is truth in context. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes Ms. Tlaib from Michigan.
Thank you so much, Chairman. Administrator, thank you so much for being here. I know it's been a long day, but this is really important in regards to something that is happening in my community. I know you probably know I'm from Michigan, and we've been hit hard the last 4 years as a result of storms and flooding. We had 2 declarations in the last 4 years for flooding. Many of my residents, still currently struggle with ongoing emotional toll, as well as the cost of flood damage, which they have yet to be able to recover to this day. In my district, though, residents live in housing that are often do not have separate rooms, or what you call occupant rooms, in the basement, and which triggers this exclusion that FEMA has right now of getting help when there's not somebody like sleeping in the basement. This was very much a surprise to me because many of my seasoned residents who had flooding couldn't get access to be able to do the cleanup, which led to such terrible damage of their basement that, and I would love to submit for the record, Chairman, article from Bridge Detroit, devastating floods leave Detroiters with toxic mold.
Without objection to order.
And in this article, it talks about the fact that many of our homes, they would get all this coverage for all these other things except the basement, where the flooding, the majority of the flooding left. I have one resident, 90-year-old woman in Northwest Detroit. If you walk into her home these days, especially at this time of the year, you'll feel cool air right coming from her kitchen to the living room. She'll tell you that 6 months has passed since the last FEMA declared flood, and your heart sinks because she has no, literally resulting from the damage of the basement, drainage issues, no hot water, rising problems related to the mold, in a broken furnace, right? And we're helping her as quickly as possible to try to see if there's any other community-based organizations. But the question then comes to my team and I is, why is this an exclusion? And would FEMA be open to working with members of Congress in a bipartisan way? Because Michigan, we got basements. And we need to be able to have some sort of a remedy that it can be a livable home. Toxic mold is dangerous for any age, but especially my seasoned residents who they're on fixed income, they do not have the resources to take care of that.
Congresswoman, the programs that we have in our individual assistance program, one, do not replace insurance. And when somebody is underinsured or uninsured, they do have access to FEMA financial assistance through our housing programs. But unfortunately, by statute, the only thing that we are allowed to provide financial assistance with is for primary living areas. Yep. And so that would be the financial assistance that they get.
I want my colleagues to hear this, especially one colleague. I think there could be a bipartisan effort here because the basement helps make the rest of the house livable. That's where the utilities are. I mean, allowing the mold to continue to grow. I had a woman in Inkster who didn't have the capacity to clean out and get the water out. It froze in the winter, causing even more damages to her home. And Administrator, I know it's statute. I just wanted my colleagues to understand it. Also, Mr. Chair, for the record, to submit after the flood article, again, continue to talk about the growing issue of flood and storms that are coming in throughout, I think, Michigan, again, impacted by the lack of, again, FEMA being able to cover or just be able to provide some sort of assistance for basements.
And Congresswoman, we would be happy to partner with you and provide technical drafting assistance. But right now, as you mentioned and as I mentioned, we are limited by statute on what we can provide financial assistance for. But we also work with our partners then. That's
I know.
The SBA comes in.
SBA is so hard. You want to tell one of my seasoned residents to get a loan from the Small Business Administration, they'll roll your eyes, probably never talk to me again. I can't do that to them. Even when I tell them they'll work with you, thinking about even a lien on their home, they just don't want to go through that process. The other thing, Administrator, I think is really important. I want to know, and please get back to me, in those two declarations in Michigan, what was the rate of denial? Because I had to go through so many appeals with our families to get them the help that they needed from FEMA. And I thought to myself, we're just denying folks. And then later, months later, but it takes so much effort to, again, get somebody to respond, help the family get the submission to appeal, and they actually get approved. But the initial denial, I just feel like we could be preventing that initial denial because it's devastating for a family. Some do not even know to call their member of Congress for help.
We would be happy to get you that information, and I'll just add that, it frustrates me equally as much that the way our current system, the platform work, sends these letters out so quickly when all we need to do often is get one additional piece of information. It's something that
it's like a receipt or something. Yeah, just tell the residents. We got to work on that because denying them, they walk away and they don't even try again.
I understand.
And I go to my town halls, I go to different places, and they'll say, well, FEMA denied me. And I said, did you try appealing? What do you mean? How do I do that? Again, I think we need a better process because our families we shouldn't be, look, we're a public government entity. We shouldn't act like the for-profit insurance companies. We should be better at this. We should move with much, much more compassion. Thank you.
Chair now recognizes Mr. Timmons from South Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank Administrator Criswell for being here. You've been here a long time today. It's about 6 o'clock. This is what, your 7th, 8th hour. We appreciate you being here to answer these questions. I don't think any of us believe that you are responsible for the conduct of some of the employees and or leadership. Who knows? We're going to get to the bottom of that, but I just appreciate you being here today. You've gotten a lot of the same questions all day, and I'm going to talk about something a little bit different. I'm going to talk about the media and how it responded to this incident. So on September 30th, President Trump posts on X about reports of FEMA not helping Republican areas, stating, quote, "I don't like the reports that I'm getting about the federal government going out of their way to not help people in Republican areas." And, President Trump posts this on social media, and the mainstream media, quite frankly, lost their mind. So let's just go over some of the responses. October 1st, here we have MSNBC what kind of would-be leader lies about a deadly natural disaster? When it comes to Donald Trump and Hurricane Helene, it's not a rhetorical question. Then we have New York Times. The former president falsely accused the Biden administration of neglecting areas that had voted for Republicans. Then we go to CNN. Trump cites baseless reports about anti-Republican bias in the North Carolina response. And then finally, Vox on October 8th. Trump falsely suggested that the federal government is purposely neglecting areas with Republican voters, but none of these claims are true. So it seems that at least one of them was true, and possibly more. Miss Washington was fired allegedly for not providing relief to hurricane victims because of their political affiliation. I mean, we've documented that. I guess one question for you is, what exactly was she fired for? So, I mean, I guess the report is that she was terminated due to her actions not adhering to FEMA's values. Is that correct?
She was terminated once I saw the written evidence that she was withholding assistance to people in communities impacted by disasters because they had a Trump sign. This goes against our core values and is inappropriate behavior.
Okay, I just want to be sure we understand, because it sounds like a catch-all, the language of a not adhering to FEMA's values. It's kind of similar to conduct unbecoming an officer in the UCMJ. But I guess my bigger issue is that FEMA did not cite a specific policy that she violated. So is there a specific policy that at FEMA that forbids discrimination of any kind, or is this just a catch-all?
We definitely have policies that prohibit the discrimination of anybody, whether it's the delivery of our disaster programs or the delivery of our grant programs that support communities to be better prepared for the severe weather events that they're experiencing.
And as you should, and I appreciate that. And obviously, Ms. Washington has made a number of claims alleging that this is systemic and that this is something that is not an isolated incident. We just had another whistleblower allege that there's additional information. So I guess you've already agreed to keep all records of every kind to make sure that this committee and that the American public is able to get to the bottom of whether this was Ms. Washington living out her own political fantasy or whether there was a systemic leadership-driven effort to deny relief to people that support President Trump. So you can, again, you've already done it 3 or 4 times, probably 30 or 40 times, you can promise that you're going to keep all information, all data, all emails, all Teams messages for this committee and for the American public to get to the bottom of this.
We archive all information, and as we have brought in the Inspector General and have been conducting our own investigation, all of that is available to them in the course of their investigation.
Well, thank you. It seems that we're going to find a number of other people that have engaged in similar behavior, and I can promise we will get to the bottom of all of it after January 20th. So, I mean, anybody that has engaged in this behavior at FEMA, I would encourage them to get their resume ready and find new jobs, because a new day is coming. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes Ms. Stansberry from New Mexico.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Administrator. I know it's been a very long day, and actually I'm grateful for the commentary that was made just before I began this opportunity to ask some questions and talk about today's hearing, because I think it's important to emphasize the statements that were just made, that a new day is coming on January 20th. And for any of you who are listening at home, what they're referring to is the inauguration day, when the Trump administration comes in and begins their purge of civil servants. And the reason why I'm emphasizing that is because, yes, we're here to discuss a very serious matter. And absolutely, under no condition should politics be the reason why someone is denied basic dignity, access to emergency resources, and comity by our colleagues, whether that's emergency aid in their homes or access to the bathroom here in the Capitol. And so I think it's important that we talk about what is actually motivating this hearing. Now, I want to take a moment. I'm a former federal employee. I used to work at OMB. Many people know that here on the committee. But I think a lot of people don't fully understand what FEMA does, its emergency response. And I want to say thank you to you and all of your team. During this summer's historic and catastrophic fires in my district, in Ruidoso and Mescalero Apache, you came to our district, your staff were on the ground immediately, and you deployed every possible resource. And I can tell you unequivocally that it was the best response I have ever seen to a natural disaster in my lifetime. And I can tell my colleagues across the aisle, that area is very much an area that votes Republican. And those of us in New Mexico, we don't care. We don't care what your political affiliation is. We're going to show up. If you're in need, if you need help, if you're having an emergency, we're going to show up. We're going to help. And so obviously all of us are deeply disturbed to learn of this incident. It sounds like the person was disciplined and dismissed, and so we're grateful for that. But I find it odd that we're having a hearing where my colleagues have spent how many hours now? 6, 8, I don't even know at this point, gaslighting us. You know, like, here we are, we're having this hearing about an incident which is totally unacceptable, and yet the gentleman who's about to take office, the president-elect, deliberately and outspokenly withheld aid from his political rivals, from the state of California, from Puerto Rico, from communities that he knew did not vote for him. And so I just find it bizarre that we're even having this hearing. And one of the things that I do think is important to emphasize is that this single most impactful thing that happened during those 2 hurricanes that happened in the October timeframe was the disinformation that dissuaded people in emergency situations from going and getting individual aid in their homes. I don't know how many people felt like they didn't get direct service from FEMA or other emergency responders, but what we do know, because the data tells us, is that there was a disinformation campaign by the candidate who was running for president, members of this committee who were spreading disinformation. And we know that thousands of people in North Carolina and across the South and Florida didn't even go and ask for assistance, even though they qualified for emergency assistance for housing, for hotels, for food, and things like that. So if we want to talk about threats to emergency response, emergency management to our communities, let's talk about one of the biggest threats, which is disinformation and eating away at the emergency services that help our communities. And I want to just close on this note, because I believe that the purpose of this committee is actually the real pretext of what's going on here is that we know, as was just stated by my friend across the aisle, that on January 20th, a new day is coming. And one of the things that we know is that a conservative agenda was put forward by the Heritage Foundation and others in Project 2025, and it called for the privatization, shrinking, and the doing away with certain parts of FEMA and emergency insurance. They are trying to distract from the fact that they know that is what's coming, that is part of the plan. They have not passed an emergency package that they were calling for to help our communities just a month and a half ago, that suddenly, well, we can't pass legislation because we don't need to get it done. So I think it's really important that the American people understand what this is. We are going to have to fight to protect our federal employees against what we know is going to be an active purge. And I want to say to all of you and to all of our first responders out there, thank you for the jobs that you do. Thank you for the lives that you save. We appreciate you so, so much, and we're going to fight for you.
Chair now recognizes Ms. Green from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. While Democrats are complaining about this lengthy hearing and about President Trump coming in and slashing and reducing the size of government, I just want to say let the purge begin, because there's people that are homeless right now in western North Carolina, eastern Tennessee, Georgia, and it's not, misinformation is not the most dangerous thing facing us. It's right now pretty much the federal government and the failure to the American people. Ms. Criswell, in FEMA's first off, let's put this up. This is the strategic plan you have posted on the FEMA website. The goal and objectives laid out in the 2022-2026 strategic plan will help ensure success for our agency, the emergency management community, and those we serve. The plan outlines 3 bold, ambitious goals to meet this challenge. You have listed as number 1, instill equity as a foundation of emergency management. 2, lead whole of community in climate resilience. 3, promote and sustain a ready FEMA and prepared nation. Ms. Criswell, in FEMA's strategic plan document that you crafted, you say, and I quote, "We must instill equity as a foundation of emergency management. Systems that foster inequality serve no one, especially in times of crisis. We must recognize that disasters affect individuals and communities differently, commit ourselves to reducing barriers to access, and deliver equitable outcomes for all whom we serve." The document adds, underserved communities as well as specific identity groups often suffer disproportionately from disasters. However, thanks to whistleblowers that came out, we found out that Trump supporters were also suffering, apparently worse than others, because their homes were skipped over. And I know you said that you fired the employee that skipped the homes of that had Trump signs, but you know, we don't believe that was a one-time incident, and now we know there's another whistleblower that has come forward and said that this happened in another state. And you see, the reason why Americans don't believe this is a one-time situation is because they're used to being treated as if they're second-class citizens by the Biden administration. Not only has this happened in FEMA, when they were suffering under horrific conditions after this hurricane, it's happened through the Department of Justice, where the Department of Justice has been used against pro-life activists, parents holding their school boards accountable, and people that protested the election on January 6th. This Biden administration, as a matter of fact, you talk about equity, has treated half of this country in our beliefs and how we feel completely unequitable. So on that note, I also want to bring up that you also said, in administering our mitigation programs, we will keep equity considerations top of mind and will include them in the competitive scoring process for programs such as flood mitigation assistance. What exactly is this scoring process that you use when you are choosing organizations to give FEMA funds to?
Congresswoman, we have a number of competitive grant programs that provide assistance across a variety of areas. The ones that you are speaking of are part of our mitigation program, where we want to build resilience in these communities so they can be stronger against some of the impacts from the severe weather events we're seeing. But we know that many communities don't have paid staff to write grants. They don't have the resources to be competitive against the larger urban areas. And so we want to make sure everybody, again, has access to the programs that we offer and that we reduce those barriers to make sure that they come in on a level playing field and can get access to make their communities stronger.
Well, in the fiscal year of 2023, FEMA spent nearly $1 billion, $789 million, to shelter illegals in the United States. This past year, it was about $641 million, and this money largely is distributed through NGOs. Here's a whole list of them. I know it may be hard to see from there, but this is a whole list of cities, states, and NGOs that received millions and millions of dollars from FEMA, and this was to house illegal aliens, not Americans, who, by the way, all that money right there, that comes from Americans' bank accounts when they write their checks to pay their taxes. Do you think it's acceptable for billions of American taxpayer dollars to be spent on housing people invading our country, but yet Americans in North Carolina, Georgia, and Florida are still homeless and have yet to fully receive support?
Congresswoman, we have been directed.
Is that equitable?
We have been directed by Congress to administer the Shelter and Services Program. If Congress chooses to change that direction, we will follow that law.
Congress is changing that direction, absolutely. We're going to put American citizens first, not migrants, because we don't believe that's equitable. You see, the situation, housing illegal aliens while Americans suffer with Americans' taxpayer dollars, that's not equitable. As a matter of fact, that's the biggest failure that could be ever done to the American people. It's such a failure, it should be treason. And that's how the American people feel. As a matter of fact, regular people are so outraged, they are pissed, furious at the fact that they feel completely failed by FEMA that's funded by their money, and yet their own money went to house illegal aliens that have invaded this country. Americans are dead today because of the failures of our border, and FEMA took care of these people. You see, we can't allow that to happen. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Chair now recognizes Ms. Presley from Massachusetts.
Administrator Criswell, thank you for your stamina here today. It's good to see you again. Thank you for joining us today and for your leadership. In the face of repeated climate disasters, mass violence, and humanitarian crises, the workers of FEMA represent the very best of public service and deserve the support of Congress. Attempts by Republicans, many of whom are climate and science deniers, in the face of a frequency of events that were once anomalies, but I digress, attempts by Republicans to question the integrity of FEMA workers is a direct attack on FEMA's mission. Its mission is especially vital for our constituents, many of whom face not only the loss of homes and livelihoods, but also lasting emotional and psychological trauma in the wake of such profound loss. Ms. Criswell, Administrator, 2 years ago, my bill, the Post-Disaster Mental Health Response Act, was signed into law by President Biden. It expands mental health supports during emergency declarations. Survivors, in my opinion, deserve not only to heal, but to thrive, and this law moves us closer to that. As someone who is deeply committed to addressing trauma, I'm proud to have partnered with you and FEMA in this fight. Bearing this in mind, can you expound, Administrator Criswell, on how FEMA is incorporating long-term mental health care into its recovery plans to support the survivors of recent hurricanes?
Congresswoman, I appreciate your partnership in pushing that bill forward, because the impact that these citizens have after a disaster is traumatizing. And what we don't want to do is re-traumatize them with the delivery of our programs. We have worked with our teams to institute a trauma-informed care approach so we can understand better how a community feels and how a community is reacting to the impacts from the severe weather event. We also have teams that go out into the field, because our staff also get traumatized with the day in and day out conversations with people who have lost everything. And it affects them personally, many of them survivors from previous storms themselves. And so this holistic mental health support is so critical, and we have to destigmatize mental health support in a way that encourages our staff, but also survivors, to get the help that they need.
Thank you, Administrator Criswell. When we focus on healing, that's right, we do have to also acknowledge the work of the healer. Who is healing the healer? So FEMA workers themselves are exposed to immense stress and trauma during their services. And as Mr. Moskowitz was alluding to earlier, there is high fatigue and burnout and low morale, because these are extenuating circumstances with which to be proximate to. What resources or initiatives does FEMA provide to support the mental health of its own personnel after a disaster?
We've taken this very seriously, and we have our own mental health advisor at headquarters, but we've also put in mental health advisors in each of our regional offices. And we send teams out into the communities, into our disaster recovery centers and our joint field offices, to make sure we're taking care of our people. And even back at headquarters, we will do stand downs to make sure that we're providing the assistance that they need, making sure they know the resources that are available to them, and that when we ask somebody, how are you doing, we're not just doing it in passing, and we're really listening so we can understand the stress that they may be going through, and encouraging them to take a break if you need a break, but come back so you can help these people.
Thank you for recognizing the importance of that work and for your continued partnership. Now, my district, the Massachusetts 7th, relies heavily on FEMA in times of crisis. That's why earlier this year I was proud to work with municipal leaders to secure $2.5 million for the Cambridge Community Center Resilience Hub and the Mill Creek Resilience Program in Chelsea and the Island and River Resilience Project in Everett. Administrator Criswell, while I understand there are many priorities before the new administration steps in, can I have your commitment that FEMA will work to quickly get these funds to my district? And can you follow up with a point of contact I can connect with to follow through on this?
Congresswoman, we'll certainly follow up with you on the status of those programs and see where they're at and what we can do to move them along.
Thank you. Like every district represented in this hearing room, the Massachusetts 7th depends on FEMA's ability to do its job. We cannot turn the agency into a political game. Instead, we must ensure FEMA and its workers have the resources, respect, and public confidence they need to continue their work. Our constituents deserve nothing less. Thank you. I yield back.
Chair now recognizes Ms. McLean. Before I recognize Ms. McLean, we want to publicly congratulate Ms. McLean for being elected the Majority Caucus Conference Chair. That's a big deal, a big high-ranking leader. We have an all-star cast of members in both parties, especially on our side of the aisle, so congratulations, Chairwoman.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
And we recognize you for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you so much. There's been a pattern of discrimination, and I think from what I've listened to, you want to clean it up today, right? You don't approve of what happened. Neither side approves of what's happened. I mean, we've seen the weaponization of the Justice Department against President Trump, the Department of Education, investigate religious affiliated universities, the DOJ and FBI targeted parents at school board meetings, blah, blah, blah. It goes on and on and on, right? And I think we all want to clean it up, right? Would you agree with that?
Discrimination should never be tolerated.
100%. Appreciate that. Now there's a confirmed discrimination against conservatives at FEMA, right? So I just want to put up this timeline to make sure I have everything correct, right? October 22nd, verbal guidance was given by Ms. Washington to skip over, for lack of better words, Trump homes. Anybody that has a sign, a Trump sign. October 24th, the whistleblower comes forward. October 27th, the team's message that we've seen was sent out. 28th of October, the complaint received by FEMA's legal staff. And October 8th, God bless you, this story became public. And then on November 9th, you became aware of it and terminated her position, correct?
I think we're missing one step in there, Congresswoman. I was made aware of it on November 7th.
November 7th.
Is that, I can't see down below the
Yeah,
October
it's not up here.
20th.
November 7th. The story became public on the 8th and then on the 9th, right? I'm sure you had.
I was made aware of it on November 7th. I directed my team to get me additional information. They presented that to me on November 9th, which is when I directed the termination of the employee.
Thank you. Did Ms. Washington receive a severance package?
I would have to check. I don't know.
When could you get back to us? So you have no idea?
I do not know what the terms of her termination were.
Who would?
I would have to check with my mission support team.
Your mission support team. Okay. So who gave Ms. Washington the authority to give the verbal guidance?
I do not know what motivated Ms. Washington to give that guidance. The direction that she gave was unacceptable and did not align with the way we conduct our business to help the American people.
What was her title?
Crew lead.
Crew lead. And how many crew leads did you have?
We had several crew leads. I'd have to get back to you with a specific number, but it's one of the lowest levels of supervision we have.
So Ms. Washington had a supervisor?
Correct.
And maybe even a supervisor above that supervisor?
Correct.
Right? There may be layers upon layers. Okay. Why do you think she felt empowered to give that guidance?
I can't speak to what motivated her to give that guidance. What I can say is I was made aware of this on November 7th. It was not acceptable behavior. When I was given the written evidence of her direction on November 9th, we directed her termination.
Who is her supervisor?
I don't know specifically who her supervisor is. I know that there's this individual, Chad, that has in her supervisory chain, but I don't know if that was her specific supervisor.
Have you done an investigation on this since November 9th?
We are currently doing an investigation. It started on October 28th.
So as of October 28th, we've done a bunch of investigations. but we have no idea who her supervisor is.
No, I said I personally do not know who her specific supervisor is. I have an agency of over 22,000 employees. I don't know the
And you have
supervisors of
supervisors
everyone.
underneath you. Do you know if anything happened to her supervisor?
This is currently under investigation. The only written evidence we had is from Ms. Washington.
So we terminated Miss Washington 3 weeks after you were made aware of it. Thank God that you were made aware of it, or this could pattern have continuously gone on, because we have layers upon layers, right? You have 22,000 people. I'm sure you have a lot of middle management, right? So you have a crew lead, you might have, I don't know what your hierarchical structure is, but you have layers of management before it gets to you, correct?
We follow a very...
That's a pretty simple question. Do you have layers of management before it gets to you?
A very,
That's a great answer.
accepted chain of command practice.
Wonderful. So I'll use your word. You have a chain of command before it gets to you. But you have no clue about what's happened to that chain of command and why somebody would let that happen under their watch. Do you think that's worthy of investigating?
I absolutely think it's
wonderful. So when can I expect a report on what has happened to those
To
people?
investigate this.
When can we expect that report? And what consequences would you expect for a supervisor who knew this was going on? Would you expect them to be terminated as well?
We have an ongoing investigation, and if we find any evidence that shows that there are additional violations of the way we conduct our business, we will certainly take appropriate action.
And would appropriate action be terminated?
To include
Termination?
termination.
Wonderful. And when can we expect this report?
Again, we've asked the IG to do this report, and I can connect with them.
Thank you.
Gentlelady yields back. Chair now recognizes Mr. Goldman from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to make sure I understand what 4 hours and 20 minutes of fuss is about. Miss Washington was a crew lead charged with helping to provide assistance to individuals in the following the hurricane. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay. You said that FEMA has 22,000 employees?
More than.
More than 22,000. Okay. And as I understand it, as soon as you saw verified written evidence that Ms. Washington used partisanship in executing her job, you immediately terminated her.
Correct.
And you're now doing an investigation to determine whether anyone else was involved in this.
Correct.
Seems like that's the right thing to do. You have a bad apple out of 22,000, and you identified it and you fired it. I don't understand what the massive fuss here is. It's obviously, as you say, unacceptable conduct, and you acted immediately. So this, I've not been in here all day, but I've heard the same questions 5 times myself. I'm sure you've heard them many more times. But it does beg the question about what happens to FEMA if partisanship bleeds into its mission. And I want to bring up 2 examples from the last administration. Hurricane Maria, you may recall, in September of 2017, hit Puerto Rico, resulting in nearly 3,000 deaths. Donald Trump was president then, and he blocked the full release of the emergency assistance appropriated by Congress in 2018 and permitted only a small percentage of the money to go to the island. He insisted that Puerto Rico was not in need of that assistance and alleged that the death tolls had been politically inflated, quote, to make me look as bad as possible. In November of 2018, California suffered the most destructive and deadliest wildfire in the state's history. Donald Trump, according to his own former National Security Council staffer, refused to approve disaster aid because the state of California had a Democratic governor and did not vote for him. In fact, this former staffer had to go and pull out the voting records from Orange County where the fire was to show Donald Trump that Orange County had more supporters for Trump than the entire state of Iowa, so that he would ultimately release the funding. Now, that appears to me to inject partisanship in administering disaster relief. Is that your understanding of what I just recited to you, Ms. Criswell?
I was not the FEMA administrator during that time, and I would not care to comment on that.
Well, I think it's pretty self-evident that that is exactly what it was. And this now has continued in the recent disasters. We're here focused on one rogue employee who was justifiably and correctly fired. But Donald Trump went on a misinformation campaign to slander your organization. He one point said that President Biden was sleeping and he was not responding to Georgia Governor Brian Kemp. Brian Kemp responded, "The president just called me yesterday afternoon and I missed him and I called him right back and he just say, 'Hey, what do you need?' And I told him, 'You know, we've got what we need. We'll work through the federal process.'" How about this one? Governor Ron DeSantis, everything we've asked for from President Biden, he has approved. And we do think we'll get more approvals. Republican Governor Brian Kemp of Georgia, we got what we need from FEMA. We've had FEMA embedded with us since, a day or two before the storm hit. Governor Glenn Youngkin, Republican of Virginia, I'm incredibly appreciative of the rapid response and the cooperation from the federal team at FEMA. Yet Donald Trump was spreading misinformation that FEMA was not doing its job. And in the last few seconds, I'd like for you to explain how that misinformation hindered FEMA's efforts to provide disaster relief to those in need.
Any type of misinformation that creates some type of mistrust in the federal government creates a lack of opportunity for individuals that have been impacted by these disasters to get the assistance that they need and that they're eligible for. And we want to be able to reach out to everybody that has been impacted and assure them that we are there to support them. They should register for assistance, and we can work with them to help them on their road to recovery.
And do you think that there were some people who did not receive disaster assistance because of this misinformation by Donald Trump?
We will never know if there are people that should have applied and didn't, but there is the possibility that individuals may not have applied for assistance because of what they were reading across social media.
Okay. Well, there are plenty of publications and media reports about that being the case, and it is a terrific shame. And thank you very much, Administrator Criswell, for all of your hard work during difficult times. I yield back.
Chair now recognizes Ms. Boebert from Colorado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Criswell, I appreciate you being here today. My colleague from Tennessee, Congressman Tim Burchett, had asked you about funding for illegals, those who have come into our country, entered our country illegally, and who were present for some of these storms. And under oath, you stated that only American citizens could apply for additional funding through FEMA. Do you stand by that?
American citizens and eligible legal aliens can...
Legal aliens, those who have come through the ports of entry legally and have their green card or anything else. Well, we have illegal aliens who have entered our country, and FEMA itself has reported $380 million in additional funding to communities receiving migrants. FEMA awards $110 million to the Emergency Food and Shelter Program to assist migrants. Another FEMA notification, Department of Homeland Security announces distribution of more than $77 million in congressional funding for communities receiving migrants. Politico says New York City to get $104.6 million from FEMA, and the list goes on and on. Even the embassy, the U.S. Embassy in El Salvador chimed in, and so I would say that there's quite a bit of money going towards illegal aliens. And Mr. Chairman, I would like to ask for this to be submitted into the record, these headlines here.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Now, Ms. Criswell, we've heard that Ms. Washington said that she's being used as a scapegoat, and I kind of lean to believe that, because here today we have this list of chain of commands. We have supervisors who are all around her, yet we can't point to any specific supervisor who's being held accountable here. We've heard that there's an investigation. We hear about investigations all the time. Ms. Criswell, I have people sit here in front of this committee and tell us all about investigations, and then we never receive any information from that. We have seen the devastation of American citizens who have been impacted by these hurricanes, and they want answers. So is Ms. Washington being used as a scapegoat for carrying out the directive to not go to homes with Trump signs?
I received information on November 7th that there was an employee that had directed homes with Trump signs be avoided.
And you terminated her, but are there others who are going to be held accountable? Now let me ask you this, okay, you have the investigation that's been asked of you. What are you going to do to preserve this investigation and ensure that it continues in the next administration?
We will fully cooperate with the IG if they choose to take on this investigation. It has also been elevated to the Office of Special Counsel.
And in this investigation, sorry, my time is running out. And in this internal investigation or outside, if you never find anyone who's actually culpable for this, are you going to take any blame?
We are conducting ongoing investigations.
Are you going to take any blame if no one is found? If no one is found?
If we find anyone that has been violating the way we deliver assistance,
I'll move on. I'm sorry, you're not answering my question directly. So this is a culture that the Biden administration has allowed to cultivate as, and I believe that you are a part of this, as FEMA. And I would hope that you would take responsibility for allowing your employees to discriminate those who they help based on politics, rather than just dismissing it on an investigation. Now, are there barriers within FEMA between public and private partnerships or relationships, or is FEMA only focused on blocking resources from Trump supporters? Can private citizens help in an emergency?
The actions of one individual are not representative of the way FEMA delivers its programs.
Can FEMA work with private citizens in an emergency to get resources to American citizens?
I think you would have to give me some specific examples of what you mean.
Okay, so we have Elon Musk. He said, quote, "My blood is boiling." Mr. Chairman, I would like to submit for the record this article that was printed in regards to Elon Musk is being furious over FEMA blocking SpaceX engineers from
Without objections ordered.
So when Elon Musk is furious that he can't get Starlink delivered to folks, when I have Congressman Corey Mills who has to deploy a mission team to bring 26 systems of Starlink to those who are suffering, when the missing persons list is 1,500 people before Starlink is brought to them by a sitting member of Congress, not by FEMA, and that number goes down to 600 once communication is able to begin, when a member of Congress has to bring 23,000 pounds of supplies, when Elon Musk is saying we want to get internet, we want to get connectivity and communication to citizens, we want to bring supplies, and yet FEMA is blocking supplies. FEMA is seizing supplies. When I have a senior high school student from Rifle, Colorado, Cody Wyatt, who is driving across country to get supplies because FEMA hasn't been seen in 11 days in North Carolina or in Pensacola, Florida, when they aren't present, can citizens help, or is FEMA going to continue to block private citizens and refuse to help those based on their political affiliation?
FEMA has never blocked any assistance from moving around any of the states that were impacted. In fact, when Mr. Musk released that statement, we had over 70 Starlink satellite terminals in and around North Carolina, exceeding what he
For
had
11
already
days,
said.
Congressman Corey Mills did not see a single FEMA representative or truck, and I have witnesses as well in Florida who did not see any help from FEMA for days.
I would like there to be before the disaster started.
We'll see in your
read in
investigation.
my testimony.
We'll see in your investigation if it's ever released.
In my testimony, my written testimony that shows our exact response. You can read the details there.
Before I recognize Mr. Burleson, the ranking member has a unanimous consent request.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Three articles here from Reuters, an article dated October 23. Fact check, FEMA disaster funds not diverted to migrants by Biden administration. Washington Post, October 4, 2024. No, Biden did not take FEMA relief money to use on migrants, but Donald Trump did. And from Axios, an article dated August 27, 2019, entitled, Trump reallocates $155 million from FEMA disaster relief to fund ICE. And then finally, one other one, which is a FEMA press release from October 1, 2024, entitled, DHS announces $210 million of additional funds to protect faith-based institutions and nonprofits against targeted attacks. Thanks so much.
Without objection to order, Chair recognizes Mr. Burleson from Missouri.
Thank you, Chairman Comer and Ms. Criswell. Thank you for being here with us today. You know, the underlying facts behind why we're here has got me thinking about, how do we end up at this point? And I think it didn't happen overnight. This is not just one anecdotal story. This is a part of a long list of grievances that the American people have experienced. The whole thing is just very, very familiar. The names change, the agencies change, the bureaucrats change, but the people on the receiving end of it are still the same. You see, the bigger the government, the smaller the individual. And it's these individuals who feel like, and they don't feel like it, they've been told that they're garbage. And they're treated like garbage. And when the President of the United States uses words like, like has been used, deplorables, garbage, Nazis, then one can expect your agencies to treat people in the way in which you're talking about them. As you know, we have a FEMA supervisor that expressly directed volunteers to go door to door offering assistance to bypass the homes of homes that had Trump campaign signs. These are American citizens. These are taxpayers. These are our countrymen and women who just lost everything, all their possessions, and they're being treated like garbage. And look, I know that you have said, and I think you've done well today, that political discrimination is not tolerated within the agency. But it looks to me, and I think it's clear to a lot of Americans that they feel the same way after the election earlier this month, and I think that's why the election results ended up the way they did, because it's the sentiment of the American people. The guy who went through, because they feel like they can relate to the guy who went through all of what was clearly a weaponized prosecution for whether it's the Department of Justice. The American citizens see that while he's being attacked by the Department of Justice, they've been attacked. We had concerned parents at school board meetings labeled as terrorists. We had Catholics labeled as terrorists. We had excessive sentences handed out for pro-life activists, and we had the aggressive targeting of President Biden's political opponents while slow-walking the Hunter Biden criminal investigation. And this is not new, because during the Obama years, we had the IRS was used to target conservative groups. Remember? I mean, we had Lois Lerner and that agency stopping the attempts for groups that had the word Tea Party or Patriot from being able to get tax-exempt status. Or how about during COVID, when the Biden administration pressured social media platforms to censor, quote, disinformation about COVID-19, including alternative treatment options, or their concerns were forced vaccinations, or if somebody had the idea that it leaked from a U.S. government-funded coronavirus lab in Wuhan rather than some animal in a wet market. The American people, who have been called garbage, we saw a federal government do more to stop the distribution of ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine than it did fentanyl. We saw all of these and more. We saw rent-a-riot campaigns like BLM and Antifa not being prosecuted for all of their fires and destruction, but yet when conservatives have a protest, it's called an insurrection. And grandmas and grandpas who supported Trump are still being thrown in jail. we saw financial institutions work with law enforcement to mark Americans as domestic terror threats for buying religious texts or firearms or supporting Donald Trump. There's so many other examples. Trump himself has been attacked by the Department of Justice, Jack Smith, Fani Willis, all this lawfare. We have the FBI censoring information about the Hunter Biden laptop. We have the Democratic Party laundering fraudulent Oppo research like the bogus Steele dossier to journalists and the intelligence agencies, all back them up, siding with a particular political party. The whole thing was so absurd and stupid, but again, this culture of political bias against conservatives and Trump is how this is cultivated. The American people want and they deserve their government to be nonpartisan. They want their government to be fair. They want justice to be blind. And they're frustrated when they see their government weaponized against them because they dare to support the guy who said, let's drain the swamp. And so this didn't happen overnight. It came from a long litany of events where some Americans were treated like garbage. And I can't wait for DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, to get in under the next administration and start making this government work more efficiently. Because this town does need a purge. This town needs an enema. And honestly, I can't wait. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes Mr. Higgins from Louisiana.
Well, that was difficult testimony to follow.
That's a tough act.
Ms. Criswell, I thank you for being before us today. Mr. Chairman, I have to say to my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, I've had extensive communications and interactions with Ms. Criswell's team, and she has personally responded to many of my inquiries, official inquiries. We've worked through hundreds and hundreds of very complicated claims after Hurricanes Laura and Delta that hit the heart of my district in the middle of COVID. It was the worst thing you could possibly imagine. Very powerful hurricanes, a Category 5 and a Category 4, back-to-back, 1 month apart in the summer of 2020. It was incredibly difficult to respond to. And so I'm just going to say that through the course of the years, I've found that Ms. Criswell's team has been about as responsive as you could find any large bureaucracy anywhere in the world. And I would challenge any colleagues that would question the good lady's character, because I have found her character to be fine. She runs an organization that many of us are almost paid to hate, you know. But it's 22,000 employees, which sometimes things can get out of hand. But I have to say, madam, that your response to my office through the years has been as excellent as it can be under difficult circumstances. Ma'am, when FEMA interacts with a particular government entity or private entity after a disaster, and planning is made and funding is shared for rebuilding, sometimes extensions for work are required. Is that correct?
Correct.
If the schedule for reconstruction is interrupted by supply chains and workforce restrictions, things like that, the entity that's in partnership with FEMA to restore their services, they have the opportunity to ask for an extension, correct?
Yes.
Okay. I have a letter, Mr. Chairman, request unanimous consent to submit from Lake Charles Harbor and Terminal District regarding just such an extension for a request for extension for permanent work to be performed. I'd ask that your office take it into full consideration, ma'am.
Absolutely, Senator.
Thank you, ma'am. I'll deliver that to you. this deal with it was outrageous. These reports that we had of a FEMA employee bypassing Trump supporters. I found it to be outrageous. How did it strike you, ma'am?
It's completely unacceptable, and it's heartbreaking to know that anybody impacted by Hurricanes Helene or Milton would have not been given the opportunity to get the assistance that they are eligible for.
Do the people of North Carolina and Florida and Georgia and South Carolina and Tennessee have your unwavering commitment to do everything in your power to help them recover?
Absolutely. We will be with all of these communities every step of the way throughout their recovery.
Okay, so I think it's fair that we hold you to that commitment, don't you?
Yes.
Yes, ma'am. Regarding this behavior out of this employee, I think you handled that. I mean, you discovered the behavior on one day, you confirmed the behavior the next day, and you fired your employee the following day. And then you initiated an investigation to look for what? If there's anything deeper, like some cultural existence that you aren't aware of this type of behavior? Is that what your investigation is seeking?
We're doing additional investigations to be certain where the direction came from.
If you find more of that, will more people get fired?
If we find any additional evidence that there was discrimination against a political party.
Thank you. Quickly, you had questioned how she came to that. Could you address for us, please, what she meant when she said avoidance first and then de-escalation, and that she mentioned avoidance several times in her statement? What is that within FEMA?
Our teams go into the field and go into communities door to door and talk to people, and we provide them safety training. It's a reactive training if they feel threatened or harassed in any way, that first they need to avoid that harassing situation, and if needed.
But have you ever instructed any of your people to, like, presume there's going to be conflict and therefore avoid a particular type of citizen?
This training is all about reacting to perceived threats. Never has it been directed to be proactive to avoid a situation.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for this hearing. My time has expired. I yield.
Gentleman yield. Chair recognizes Mr. Langworthy from New York.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Administrator Criswell, the reports of this FEMA employee directing volunteers to bypass properties of Trump supporters is an absolutely disgusting affront to the mission of FEMA and the trust of the American people in all of their federal government. FEMA exists to serve all Americans at times, in their darkest hours, in their times of crisis. And this has got to be delivered without bias or favoritism or despite any level of discrimination. Yet here we are discussing allegations that there was political discrimination tainting FEMA's response. I mean, I really appreciate you being as forthright as you've been today, but after Hurricanes Helene and Milton, countless Americans lost their homes, their businesses, and their livelihoods. Their worlds were turned upside down, and FEMA should have been the lifeline. It should be a beacon of hope for any community that has been ravaged by disaster. And if this situation was flipped and this was happening to those that supported Kamala Harris, the outrage across this country would have been deafening. The media would have been going crazy. Yet, we didn't have that same level of outrage. This is symptomatic of a dangerous and growing culture of bias throughout this entire federal government. And I would hope that FEMA would be the last agency to ever contribute to that, because you truly are dealing with American citizens at their darkest hour. We need to be about Americans helping Americans, period. End of story. No matter where you are, where you come from, or who you support for President of the United States. When disaster response has been corrupted by political bias and gamesmanship, the American public's faith in this federal government gets broken permanently. And it's really tough to erase that stain. So I take you at face value that you're a person of action and you want to fix this. But what bothers me is how this employee got to this moment. and what culture existed around them where they thought it was okay to guide other employees to say, no, skip those houses. I mean, are you aware of any of your employees that felt that Trump supporters were dangerous to approach their homes? I mean, what was, in your initial portions of your investigation here leading to the termination of this employee, I mean, what was it that, you know, she expressed as to why we would avoid these Trump households?
I can't speak to the motivations that drove her to send that message, but the actions that she took were completely unacceptable. We have initiated ongoing investigations, and if we find any further evidence that this is broader than this incident, then we will take appropriate action.
I mean, since you've been at FEMA, has political affiliation ever been classified by FEMA or any other federal agency, to your knowledge, as a dangerous community trend?
Never.
Okay. Did your employees and volunteers go to properties with any signage or flags or memorabilia supporting Kamala Harris or any other of the Democratic candidates running for office across the country?
Other than the information that I have from this one incident, we have gone to tens of thousands of homes across all 6 states impacted.
So yes or no, are you aware of any directive from supervisors at FEMA to avoid properties with any Democratic or Republican signage for that matter?
I have given no evidence, and I am not aware at this time.
Okay. I think that this investigation is really important, that you're on, and I'm really going to be looking for a keen interest to the final product, you know, as you finish that product. Any timeline is when that investigation might conclude?
We have reached out to the Inspector General to conduct the investigation. I can't speak to what their timeline will be.
I think it's really important to restore faith for all Americans in many parts of the federal government, but FEMA in particular. So I really look forward to hearing, you know, from you more in the future. In my remaining time, I'd like to quickly revisit a letter that I sent earlier this year urging FEMA to update its methodology for snowstorm-related reimbursements. In its response, FEMA stated that it's working with NOAA on potential updates. And as winter approaches, lake effect snow season in Buffalo, New York is coming. It's crucial that, to my constituents in Western New York, that we know that FEMA is taking proactive steps to ensure the most current standards guide federal assistance decisions. Can you give an update on any progress FEMA and NOAA have made in their efforts to modernize its methodology?
I know following the historic snow season that we've had last year and previous years, our teams have been working on that, but I would have to get back to you specifically as to where that's at.
Okay, we look forward to following up. Thank you very much, Director, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, gentlemen. And I assume the Inspector General is watching this hearing. This committee has jurisdiction over the Inspectors General. I can't encourage the Inspector General enough not to take this investigation seriously and report back to the ranking member, myself, as soon as possible. Chair now recognizes Mr. McCormick from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for allowing me to be part of this very important discussion. I appreciate all the first responders across the nation who have done their very best, including those people who are part of FEMA, to help those people most in need, especially during these dire times. I think we really owe it to the people to be accountable for where the money goes and who are helping, and I think that's what this is really about. One of the interesting things came across when we were reviewing your budget. Can you tell me what your annual budget is for disaster relief out of FEMA?
In this continuing resolution, we were given just over $20 billion for fiscal year 25.
So it's not $38.2 billion, it's $20 billion, is that what you said?
Out of my overall budget, just over $20 billion is for disaster relief.
Okay, specifically. And according to your September report that you submitted, what percentage of that went towards COVID?
I don't have the report in front of me, sir, but the COVID reimbursements are part of the disaster relief fund reimbursements to communities that had impacts. I'd have to get back to you on this.
According to your report in September, 40% of your budget went towards COVID relief. I just want to, that's not talked about very much. Now, I'm an ER doc. I got my MBA. I was actually serving on the front lines of the COVID pandemic during the entire pandemic. Can you tell me when the pandemic was no longer a pandemic according to the President of the United States?
We closed the incident period in May of last year.
Okay. And yet we spent 40% of our budget from this year's budget on COVID relief instead of hurricanes and other things. Is that correct?
Again, I don't have the numbers in front
According
of me,
to
but
your
those are
report-
major disaster declarations that were eligible for reimbursement.
According to your report, I'm going to inform you, can prove me wrong by submitting your papers later on, but according to your report submitted just 2 months ago, we spent 40%. I want that number to sink in. 40% of our budget for disaster relief was spent on COVID, which was done a long time ago. I was there when it started. I was there when it ended. I know what the reaction was to. I know the overspend on it. I know where the waste, fraud, and abuse was. It makes me sick to my stomach. It's one of the main reasons I'm here in Congress. And to see a disaster relief spent on something that was behind us, probably paying off a lot of waste, fraud, and abuse, in my opinion, quite frankly. And I'd love to see that reviewed by Oversight. Because this is what's wrong with government. They spend 40% of their budget on something that happened 2 years ago, and we have not enough money to deal with what's happening right now. And quite frankly, the whole COVID relief thing, I saw where the money was spent. I saw how haphazardly it was spent. And I saw who it benefited and who it didn't. And I know a lot of millionaires and billionaires that benefited greatly off that money that was spent from the United States government, taxpayers. And that's what I'm very upset about. And that's why I'm here today as part of the COVID committee, as a doctor who watched this stuff happen firsthand. And now to see a budget that I think is very dishonest. I think you guys should be, I know what happened with somebody who skipped over a Trump house. I get that, and I think it's environmental as far as the way that the prevailing attitude was. I understand you've fired somebody, which I'm very happy about. I understand you're looking into other people that might be at odds with what you're supposed to accomplish. But to have a budget that's dedicated almost half of their budget to something that ended a long time ago, can you explain that?
All 50 states received a disaster declaration in the previous administration to support their reimbursements for the costs experienced from
For this year?
COVID-19. These are all payments from the disaster declarations declared during the previous administration in 2020.
So you mean to tell me that you had to do it?
These were presidentially declared disasters, just like all disasters. And as people,
So you're saying yes, you had to do it. Is that correct?
Yes, as
So
communities.
you're by law binded to spend 40% of your budget on COVID response.
We are abided by law to reimburse jurisdictions that received a presidential disaster declaration to reimburse them for the costs as eligible under the law.
So I'm new to Congress, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I'm new to Congress. I'm not really have the experience that you have. But as an oversight guy who spent a lot of your time getting to the bottom of these egregious errors, and you can fact check me on the other side of the aisle too, but I have a hard time believing that by law we had to spend 40% of a budget on disaster relief for this year based on something that ended a couple years ago.
I agree.
I'm just trying to figure out where that went. And that's why I'm here in Congress. I hope you can work with me, and I hope you can work with me to get to the bottom of why we have those kind of stupid spending laws in America, and we can end those things for good, because that is the biggest part of the problem of government as I see it. Thank you. With that, Mr. Chairman, I rest.
Very good question. Chair now recognizes our last questioner, Mr. Stubbe from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for allowing me to join the committee today in this important hearing. And as I assume that the director knows, my district has been devastated by 6 major hurricanes in just the last 2 years. Just a few months ago, my district experienced 3 major hurricanes in 3 months and 2 in 2 weeks. A little over 2 weeks after Hurricane Helene took out my district with a 5 to 7 foot storm surge, Hurricane Milton, a Category 3 hurricane, made landfall in my district with a 7 to 8 foot storm surge and over 100-mile-an-hour winds. Some of the same businesses that I visited and ripped drywall out of because of Hurricane Helene, 2 weeks later got flooded again. So as you can imagine, my district, both Republicans and Democrats, and Floridians in general, were outraged to learn that FEMA had been avoiding conservatives, Trump supporters, white males, etc. Ranking Member Raskin in the beginning of this hearing stated, and I quote, "No one should play partisan politics with disaster aid." But that's exactly what your agency has been doing. In the aftermath of such devastation, the American people expect and trust that FEMA will administer disaster relief in a fair manner. Unfortunately, we recently learned that a FEMA supervisor in Florida named Marnie Washington directed subordinates to skip homes displaying support for President Trump. Despite your testimony, this now former employee claims this was a widespread practice under a policy she termed avoidance. No matter who initiated this avoidance policy, it was a malicious act that resulted from a corrupt culture within FEMA. Administrator Criswell, I wrote you a letter on November 15th in which I asked for information related to this incident. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to enter the letter into the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Although I asked for my answers by November 25th, perhaps you have enough information to at least answer one of my questions, and I've heard some of your answers are related to this. So I've heard, well, let me just ask it as I asked it in the letter. Is it agency policy for FEMA canvassers to practice avoidance in certain circumstances?
We provide safety training to our staff as they are going out into communities door to door, and part of that safety training includes how to avoid or de-escalate potentially harassing situations in reaction. None of that is directed at being proactive to avoid certain situations that they may perceive without an actual threat.
But it's subjective, right? It's subjective on the person canvassing. So if that person is a Democrat, which you're in a Democratic administration, you're a Democratic appointee, you're probably hiring mostly Democrats over Republicans, you have a Democratic administration. If it's a Democrat who already believes that a Trump supporter, that a Caucasian person is not what they would not feel comfortable talking to that person, because it's subjective in nature, they would skip that house to avoid that. They could do that.
No, that would be an unfair
Well,
characterization.
that's not what other people have been saying that has been reported. When did this policy go into place? Did you start this policy?
We provide, this policy has been in place since we've had these teams going into the field as they encounter people all the time, and it is designed to be reactive.
When was this specific avoidance policy put in place?
I would have to get back to you, sir.
Okay. In media appearances, Ms. Washington alleges that she was instructed by a FEMA supervisor named Chad Hershey to practice avoidance. As part of your investigation, have you interviewed Mr. Hershey?
I personally have not interviewed Mr. Hershey, but there are ongoing investigations.
Well, I would ask the IG to interview him. There were 13 people on the text chain with Ms. Washington. Have they given sworn statements in the course of your department's investigation?
I would have to check with the Office of Professional Responsibility as to who they have gotten statements from.
Can you provide the names on that text message list, the 13 people that works for FEMA, to this committee to further this investigation and oversight over your...
We will work with this committee to provide information as appropriate as part of this investigation.
Earlier today in the Transportation Committee, you stated, and I quote, "There is not a widespread culture problem at FEMA." Unfortunately, the evidence contradicts your assertion. In a report published by the Daily Signal, a former FEMA employee, so this isn't Mrs. Washington, this is somebody else, a former FEMA employee who spent over 5 years at your agency stated, and I quote, "FEMA's rotten to a core. It's overstaffed, it's bureaucratic, and they don't really help anybody." Referring to the Trump flag incident, the former employee said, and I quote, "They were told to avoid Trump, avoid any house that has a Trump sign, in a verbal meeting. I've seen that happen," we were told. Quote, "Don't go into any house that looks suspicious." They would use words like hick, cowboys, rednecks. You can change that over to Trump supporters and MAGA. So I guess that explains why FEMA has never stopped in my house over the 6 hurricanes that we've had, because I check all 3 of your boxes: a Trump supporter, a white male, and a cowboy. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to enter the Daily Signal article into the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
After the initial story broke, we sent an email to my district requesting any of my constituents who felt like they had been politically discriminated by FEMA. And just since last week, we've had over 35 people who live and reside in my district, who are citizens in my district, who have given us specific instances, factual instances, where they were either overlooked or specifically discriminated against because of their political affiliation. This is the exact type of weaponization of the federal government that put Trump back in the White House. Starting with the DOJ, the FBI, the intelligence agencies, the weaponization of the Justice Department against President Trump, and now it's been weaponized against the American people in the form of disaster aid, and it's atrocious. Thank God President Trump won, and he can restore this department into what it should be, not partisan, helping every American that's been affected by a disaster, and I yield back.
Will the gentleman yield for one question?
Sure.
You were kind enough to quote me at the beginning of your remarks, Mr. Stubbe, saying that partisanship should not enter into the distribution of disaster aid. And I think we found unanimous agreement on that point with respect to this discrete episode that took place in Florida. But several members on our side have cited the president-elect, when he was president before, withholding aid and altering the distribution of aid, or attempting to, California, to other Puerto Rico, other places, on precisely the basis of partisanship, and no one on your side spoke up about that, but since you endorsed the general principle, I wonder if you would agree that if such a thing were to take place by a president, perhaps you disagree with the reporting on it, but if it were to take place, that would be equally or even more wrong than one person doing it on a particular city block.
I don't care who the administration is or what agency it is. If they're discriminating against political party beliefs and not getting federal government aid for that, that is wrong, which is why Ashley Moody, our Attorney General of the state of Florida, is suing FEMA exactly for that reason.
Thank you much.
Very good. All right. Madam Administrator, that concludes our hearing today. I want to thank you for your testimony today. I know there were many questions. There are going to be some follow-up questions. We're in communication with other members and other people who have suggested that maybe the incident here wasn't an isolated incident, so we're going to have communication back and forth. We look forward to that IG report coming very soon. And with that, and without objection, all members have 5 legislative days within which to submit materials and additional written questions for the witnesses, which will be forwarded to the witness. If there's no further business, without objection, the committee stands adjourned. Thank you.